Hello and welcome to my channel. I'm Dr. Kate Boyd, a pianist and professor of piano, and I'm here to help you take your piano playing to the next level. This video is a continuation of my series on sight reading at the piano. Sight reading is one of the most important skills you can develop as a pianist. Being able to sight read makes it much easier to learn pieces more quickly. It'll save you a ton of time when you're trying to learn new music because instead of spending hours assembling the piece one note at a time, you'll be able to basically play through the piece right away, even if it's not perfect yet, and then go from there. Not only that, but if you're pursuing a career in music and you're able to sight read well, you will be in demand. Sight reading is a valuable skill in professional settings, and if you can sight read well, it opens an awful lot of doors. In my own professional life, sight reading plays an important role for me. When I'm teaching my students, I will sight read their music at the other piano. When I was in graduate school, I had an assistantship that required collaborative playing, and I had to sight read a lot for that. Sight reading is also a great way to improve your overall musicianship. The better you are at sitting down and reading music at sight, the more quickly your brain is going to be able to process and interpret the musical notation on the page. This will improve your playing and your understanding of music in general. Fortunately, sight reading is a skill that you can learn and develop. In this video, I'm going to share with you the 4 biggest mistakes I see people make when they're working on their sight reading. And I made an acrostic out of it. I'm calling this the RICE sight reading method because the first letter of each point is R-I-C-E. So let's get started. R is for rhythm first. There are 2 main components that render something recognizable when we listen to music: rhythm and the actual notes you play. The number 1 mistake people make when they sight read at the piano is they focus on correcting the notes as they go rather than playing the correct rhythm. On the surface, this makes sense. It's jarring and it's uncomfortable to us to hear somebody sing a familiar tune horribly off key, and it can feel literally upsetting to play music and miss notes without going back and fixing them. Speaking for myself, it's sort of like on some level we have this very human need to look competent, and on some subconscious level there's the feeling that if you don't correct the notes, it could appear that you didn't even notice them, so you go back right away and you clean them up as you go. Unfortunately, this completely messes up the rhythm. To illustrate this issue of rhythm versus melody, I'm going to play something on the piano and I want you to try to identify what song I'm playing. And I'm only going to play it using the rhythm. I'm going to just play it on one single note. Did you guess happy birthday? Right? Happy birthday to you, etc. Now you know what the song is, but even so, I'm going to demonstrate what it sounds like if I play the correct notes, if I go back and fix the notes, but don't pay attention to the rhythm. Which version was more difficult to make out what the song was? Now you might be familiar with the tune Happy Birthday, and I told you what it was, so you were listening out for that. But imagine if it's something that you've never heard before. Good luck trying to get a sense for what that piece is about. If you play the correct notes but incorrect rhythms, you might personally feel satisfied that you went back and you corrected the mistakes as you made them, but it's very frustrating or difficult for the listener to easily comprehend what you're playing. So when you sight read, make sure you understand the time signature and the rhythms before you play. And that's why on my sight reading checklist, I start by looking at rhythm and meter before we start talking about key signature and melody. I is for intervals matter. Another big mistake people make when they sight read is trying to identify each individual note name as they play it. Again, it's completely understandable, and I think it comes from a plate of great conscientiousness. But the thing about sight reading is you really can't afford to be fastidious when you do it. You gotta be able to scan the music and see what's coming up in groups of notes, not individual notes. And that's why it's super important to develop the skill of noticing the relationships between the notes rather than identifying notes in isolation from one another. After all, when you sight read, you're making sound in real time, not just identifying note names and picking out one note at a time. Once you start noticing these relationships between the notes, you can start to identify visual patterns that relate to how something feels under the hand. So for example, a skip is a line to a line or a space to a space. Noticing that, you'll be able to start to develop the sensation that when you see line to line or space to space, it's approximately this far on the keys, regardless of where you play. Now, of course, black to white to black, yes, sometimes the interval is slightly larger, but overall, there is a different feeling from a skip to a step, which would just be adjacent notes. For larger intervals, you can start to notice triads or chords, stacked intervals. A triad in root position is 2/3 stacked on top of each other, and it feels a particular way. Other inversions of chords will have a fourth on the bottom. That feels slightly different, a slightly larger stretch on the bottom. And I'm thinking intervallically, I'm not thinking in terms of note names. You'll start to feel how that feels under the hand when you see certain note relationships on the page. Another thing to notice is an octave that comes up really often in music, and it's a space to a line or a line to a space, and it is a certain distance apart, and it should feel a certain way in your hand so that you can just see that interval on the page and then know exactly how to set your hand to get that octave. Focusing on this and training yourself to notice the actual physical distance between the notes based on scanning intervals on the page will help you improve your sight reading skills. C is for continuity, always. The next common mistake people make when sight reading is starting and stopping. Being able to play something without stopping is called continuity. Now, I sort of touched on this in my previous 2 points, but this is such an important element, I need to talk about continuity as its own thing. When you sight read, you shouldn't be starting and stopping. If you miss notes, keep on going and adjust as you go. The thing is, people say that all the time. This is like the #1 sight reading advice that we get. They say, go, just keep going, don't stop no matter what you do. But the fact of the matter is, this is really hard to do. And that's what makes sight reading so frustrating. As musicians and as people, it offends our sensibilities to play imperfect, messy things and not stop to correct them. And yes, in an ideal world, we would play with perfect notes and perfect rhythm. But here's the thing. Nobody sight reads without missing notes. It just happens. It's a complex skill, and what you're doing is taking in information with your eyes and translating it into physical motions that result in pleasing sounds. You're just gonna miss notes. So make your peace with that fact and learn to keep going and adjust your hand position and not let it throw you off as you go. Continuity matters. And this leads me to the letter E. E is for easy is best. A lot of times people try to sight read by playing music that is far too difficult for them. There is the perception that since sight reading is a skill you can practice, then you must be able to advance your sight reading skills more quickly by reading harder and more difficult pieces. Unfortunately, this is not true. Improving your sight reading relies on making incremental gains that you almost won't even notice from one day to the next. Then over time, you gradually layer on and build on that progress. If you're serious about improving your sight reading skills, you need to be thinking in terms of a 4 to 6 month timeline. You want to read as much music as you can, and you want to successfully read as much music as you can. And this is the mistake I see people making. Choosing something that's far too hard, bashing through it, playing it terribly, and then not learning anything from it. A good rule of thumb is that you should be able to play it around 80% accurately. And it really shouldn't feel too hard for you. It shouldn't feel like this Herculean effort to get through the thing. It should have an appropriate level of challenge. It's really similar to reading text. There's a reason we start students with phonics and patterns of letters that make certain sounds so that a reader can more easily scan text and not just look at individual letters. There's a reason that we don't start by jumping into Proust immediately after learning the alphabet. In terms of finding music to read, there are different strategies you can take, but ultimately, you just want to be reading stuff that is 2 to 3 levels easier than the repertoire that you're currently playing. One thing I recommend is to use a graded repertoire series or a method book and then work your way through the books. I'm going to be making a video about sight reading resources where I'll go into depth about more ideas on where to find sight reading materials. But for now, remember, if you have to stop and go note by note, it's too hard for you. Pick something easy enough to succeed at and practice it a couple of times through until it's correct. Don't just force yourself to read it one single time and move on. The benefit comes from the process of spending a little bit of time speed learning or micro learning something and then moving on. I made another video about sight reading where I go step by step through my sight reading checklist and I show how I apply that checklist to sight reading a piece on the piano. The checklist applies to music at all levels. You can download that checklist in the description below and you can check the video out right up there. So go ahead and click right there to continue. I'll see you in the next video and happy practicing.